Good morning. It's Emil Composer here. It's been really busy. I've had a lot going on. I haven't really been thinking heavily about this project, but maybe we'll talk a little bit about form and creative process, even though this is not something that I've been thinking about at the moment. I was thinking about it a lot before, and then a bunch of other stuff happened, and what's she gonna do? But yeah, I was gonna talk a little bit about the conception of how I think about putting a project together. And there's generally two different, well, I hesitate to say two different approaches. There's many different approaches to writing pieces. There's two different approaches that I've sort of considered as I've been working. Like in terms of creative and formal construction, like the sort of thing you'd hear in an orchestration class is you'd talk about how composers would work in a reduction or a short score with notes on what they want for color while they're writing, because I think the process was largely, okay, my mind's not working fast today. No, the process was largely like, just imagine you have like a piano sonata or something, a piece of music like that, or a string quartet or whatever, and there's a use of motives, motivic development, themes, structure, and generally it occurs to me that the thought process was largely, let's take something that would be a black and white painting or black and white pencil sketch or whatever on a piece of paper, and let's render it as an object in color. Let's color it. So that's kind of the thought process that went behind writing music, and this is like common practice era music. And I think now there's a little bit, well, at least, okay, I'm sitting here stumbling over my words because I realize that there's so many different ways of conceiving music, but I know there is a modern approach to orchestration, which is primarily concerning oneself with color and texture. That's sort of using that as the primary drivers of moving a piece forward. So, like when I was studying composition, I was working with Christos. He talked a lot about, okay, we are going to think of an orchestra piece. He likes to write it as a full orchestra, and he'll often use Cubase to be able to hear everything he's doing in a mock-up form as he's constructing it. And evidently, like the difference between digital orchestrators and say like people who are writing for live instruments is one about conception, because you have to understand what the live instruments can and cannot do if you're writing for live instruments. And I mean, this isn't saying that there's anything wrong with digital composition at all. It's just like you can't. It's like the difference between trying to make pizza in a standard convection oven versus in a stone oven or something like that. And it's like the process that you use in order to make the music will change the flavor of the end result of the music. It's just two different things. It's like A and B. But so I was studying with Christos, and his sort of conception is always that he thinks of orchestra as being its own thing, so he likes to write for the ensemble in the sense that he lets the timbral aspects of the ensemble dictate the creative outcome to a certain extent. So for him, the idea of texture and color plays a lot more of a primary role, but he's not doing that by excluding other potential parameters in his music. So he uses melody and harmony and motivic and thematic development in his music as well. And that's a part of what he does. But so I'm walking into this in sort of a similar situation. And I had an opportunity to write for the Winnipeg Youth Orchestra here. And I'd finished the piece, and it was interesting to hear it on a concert with other composers from from like the common practice era, like Mendelssohn, for example. I mean, while their music was very colorful, it does really sound like it's a coloring of a concept or an idea or a sort of narrative. It's been kind of colorized after the fact. And what I noticed was that my music had harmonic, like had rude motion, harmonic energy, and harmonic direction in it, and it had melodic content and motivic development. But the texture and then the color was something that it was different. It was a lot more forward, and the music had a lot more happening on that level. You could see that was something that was intentionally put into the craft. So that's kind of the different ways of working and approaching. And I mean, I've done just a lot of writing in Finale, but I think what Christos likes about using Cubase, it's more labor intensive, but when you're going and trying to do your best possible work, you probably need to do whatever it takes in order to get it the way you want. I mean, as an aside, I was working with a friend's music, and he wrote it all in with pencil on staff paper. So he was writing the manuscript with staff paper, and they had to deliver this thing to the MCO as a digital copy. So he hired me to actually do the engraving or creating the digital copy of the score. And what was interesting to me is that he was writing, and he could hear what he was doing, and largely I was able to review the piece having Finale with the playback. And like my score reading's pretty. My score reading for note identification is pretty good, but for hearing music is like, I'll listen in my head to like really easy piano and guitar pieces and stuff, and I can hear how that music sounds. But when it comes to a big orchestra piece, that for me, I can't really do that. Gary Kulesha is a composer who can. He's an exceptional score reader. He just flips and hears the whole thing in his head. Yeah. And I think technology's largely made that sort of part of the developmental creative process difficult to develop, because we kind of have a different... We're able to make mock-ups, make demos. That's a different thing. But yeah, what I'm saying is... Right, there was one section of my friend's piece where he created a rhythm part. And it was a really cool idea in theory, but he looped the same like 2 quarter notes worth of material for an extended period of time. And his comment to me was, well, I can't hear how this sounds. And I thought to myself, yeah, and it's not going to work for that reason. So we'd had a conversation about editing it, and I'd suggested I would play out all the ideas on my cello. Like it was like textural, sort of like extended technique effects thing that he was using to create almost like a drum set sort of a sound. I said I'm going to import what he has into Cubase and then record out those parts so that we can actually hear how it sounds in the piece. And then from there, we'll be able to do the edits to make the part compositionally interesting. I mean, I know how this is going to go. The players are just going to say, oh, this is terrible. They're just going to complain about it. And that's just not good. And I can't leave a brother hanging, you know. But yeah, so anyway, that's the thing is, I think that if you're going and you're trying to create the best possible piece that you can, you're going to need to use every tool to your advantage to be able to execute exactly what it is that you want to create. And I think that that's kind of the benefit of doing something like in Cubase. And Christos had told me he went and bought, like, Earcam has this, that's like an institution for contemporary music. It's IRCAM. You can just type in caps and look it up. They have a sample library, and it's all like extended techniques for orchestra, which is really cool, because then it's like you actually can hear how what you're calling for is going to sound if you want to really move the orchestra beyond sort of the conventional process for performance. You know, it's hard to. Well, yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking. Anyway, I don't know what I'm going to do in this area, but I think that using all the techniques that are available to you as a composer when the music calls for it is the best approach to writing. And I think it's best to don't try to include something for the sake of including it, but try to have it as part of the music just because of the fact that the music requires it, and that makes the music interesting in some way. And I'll give, I guess I could do a brief example of this. I'm not even getting to the point of what I wanted to talk about just yet, not really, but I think this is all important because it's all part of the process. So I was working on my thesis. It was an orchestra piece, and I'm like, okay, this goes against my usual mandate in that I usually don't want to do too much pre-composition, but I thought to myself, okay, I'm going to write this piece, and I need to do something that would be, I guess, reflective of the fact that I am applying for a doctorate in music composition. So I did two things in the piece, well, three things in the piece that were kind of interesting. I mean, the first thing was I was really blending textural music, just kind of throwing it together with like harmonically driven thematic motivic music. And what was interesting about it is the fact that I think it creates a certain disconnect for a lot of people when they hear it, because they're trying to decide if it's one or the other, but it's kind of both. But what I did was I like the idea of the micro polyphony that Ligeti uses in atmospheres, but I thought you can't really hear the individual lines. So I did something, I called it, like cheekily called it macro polyphony, where I was creating these moving complex, well, not really super complex, but these moving lines, but there was only like 5 to 10 of them, so you could actually hear the motion. So I did that, and then the other thing that I did was like, I'm going to control the range, like the distance of the harmonic motion and the rate of harmonic change, like with the root motion and stuff. So what I did was it starts off very static and there's not a lot of motion in it. It increases up in speed to a focal point, and then it decreases after. There was that. And then yeah, the other thing I did was we have the theme, like the main melodic material shows up in the middle of the piece, and basically what you do is there's fragments of it, so it kind of develops in reverse, so it's kind of like fragments that can chill together into a theme in the middle of the piece. So that was the other thing, almost like a reverse development. So that was kind of how I constructed that piece. But yeah, so back to the current project. I love the idea of snow falling, and I wrote a trumpet and piano piece about that called Winter, and I've always kind of puzzled over how some of those piano lines would sound, in a more moderate register on a harp. I've been thinking about that, which is kind of why when I was doing the score setup, I was thinking about what I wanted in terms of forces for percussion. But largely what I was thinking with a 20-minute piece, you can usually only really say something substantive with orchestra forces in about 10 minutes. That gives you, I find in general, 10 to 12 minutes gives enough time to really create a large-scale narrative in a work without needlessly boring people. I mean, I'm not calling Mahler boring, but it's definitely a certain mindset, is an endurance mindset to listening with that kind of music. When it's really heavy, it's demanding on the listener in a way. You feel exhausted, not revitalized when you get through the piece. You feel satisfied and exhausted. It's like a good mental workout. But so I'd said 20 minutes. I wanted to make sure that there would be quite a bit of material that for the people doing the remixing. But at the same time, it also needs to be something that potentially can be programmed. So these are the different things that I'm thinking about. So I know it's kind of like overdone, but I like the idea of doing a slow, fast format. I've only been really thinking about the slow format, and I've really been sort of visualizing cool kind of textures and sound painting that I can do, which I think is one of the things that an orchestra can do that a piano just can't do in the same way. And as much as I want to have melodically driven music, I really, really like the idea of texture and sound paintings and stuff as well. It just creates, it can be very, very soundscapey, which I think is a really nice aspect of what the ensemble can render in a, a convincing way. So I guess the next sort of step is going to be sketching. I'm not sure. I might sketch in Cubase and in Finale and see what I get. The thing that I don't like about Cubase is that the digital instruments are limited in a way that players are not. And players are limited in a way that acoustic instruments are players that are, sorry, the digital instruments are not. And I don't want to be writing, because my habit in Cubase when I'm scoring a film is to write for the limitations of the digital instruments to try to make it sound somewhat realistic or convincing, like convincingly enough that it's not distracting. And I don't want that to be, I don't want my compositional process to reflect that as I'm going through the writing, and it needs to be that what I'm writing is going to work optimally for live players, because that's the end goal. And I think, I mean, I know there's a lot of Twitter debate about that as well, with live versus digital, which I think is frankly a stupid debate, as I've said earlier. But I really think that that's the distinction. It's not about what's better or what's worse, but it's about the process, and about it's a motive, it's a mentality, a mode of thinking. It's just like recording versus live performance, where recording is very microscopic, and you're dealing with something that's very, very zoomed in and detailed, and every pick attack matters on the guitar, that sort of thing. Versus live, where live is about communication. And I think live instruments versus live or recorded instruments versus using digital instruments is the same. It's not, it doesn't like bifurcate in the same way. It doesn't sort of shake down in the same way, but it's the same sort of thing conceptually, where when you're working with digital instruments, you're trying to get the music to speak and sound in a certain way. And it's basically, I mean, what sounds good is always the end goal, right? So I think that conceptually, if you're writing for digital instruments, you need to think of what your sort of your mandate is as a writer, and kind of what the end goal is. These are the ingredients I'm cooking with. Therefore, I need to work in a way that gives me the end result I want. And it's just that when you're going into working with and recording live players, it's not better. It's like saying the music in Ori is better than the music in Hollow Knight, and I don't really think that one is better or worse. It's just a different aesthetic either way. But just when you're writing for live players, you need to be cognizant of what the outcome is going to be. And sometimes it's a case of practice, and sometimes it's a case of getting the music down and going and talking to players and getting revisions together, because some things that you think would be beautiful just don't come out well. I mean, I had a conversation with a composition student about this, and he's like, but those notes just sound so good. I said, when they play it, it's not going to sound so good. That's not. I'll show you on the cello how it looks. He's like, what? I said, it's so angular and awkward. And you need to write this in a way that's going to sit well under the fingers. It is the same way with wind instruments and blowing, like brass instruments. We generally sing the lines when it comes to brass instruments. Know where the extremes are for the register. Know where it's comfortable for them. Know where they're going to have dynamic control, and sing the lines so they can play them. Because it could be the coolest thing you could ever come up with, and then it just doesn't work on the instrument. It's just not possible. It's like trying to play Bach cello music with one hand on the piano, and it's because we have such a range that we can cover in one position on a cello, just because of the fact that the strings are tuned in fifths. You can really jump around. You can write things that are quite angular on strings, and they often, if they fit under the shape of the hand, they're quite comfortable. But then you go and you try that on piano, and the thing is, the piano chords tend to be really tight and really constricted sounding. And that's kind of part of the idiom, because it's really difficult to play massively wide spaced chords unless you're actually arpeggiating the chords. But I think that's a huge conversation. I think we've covered a lot of ground. I don't know that there's any sort of landing point off of here, which is sort of a basic conversation of the sort of brainstorming part of composing, and what process should be, and where, kind of coming up with with your on ramp or whatever to the creative process. I mean, the next thing I would talk about would be writing process, but I think I should do that in a different video. I think we've covered way too much, and these videos tend to get long, and we'll see who's interested. There's a lot of information in here, but I don't know what the demand is to consume it. But I wish you guys all a good day, and I will see you next time. Take care.